Thanks everyone for joining us, and thanks for joining us here on the second day of the inaugural National Financial Advisors Week. It's a pretty significant undertaking, I think. It's got a lot of potential. I thank Nick Stuller and Larry Light for putting this together. I think it's a great event, and hopefully you guys are getting something out of it. Today we're going to be talking with Eric Hutchinson. You want to just tell us a little bit about your practice, Eric, and we'll get into the questions.
Be happy to. Delighted to be here. My practice is focused on retirement planning, so most of the people that we serve, thinking about their retirement is the primary focus of what they're thinking about. And that has been true in working with both individuals and families, and we also do a lot of work with 401k plans and the participants in those 401k.
Mm-hmm. So the topic for this discussion is what can a financial advisor do for you? And I'm going to add a nuance to that. What can a financial advisor do for you, given that I, Mr. or Mrs. Investor, am not at all a newbie when it comes to investing? Mm-hmm. In fact, I'm financially savvy, I'm knowledgeable, I'm well-read, I'm an educated consumer. I watch CNBC, God forbid.
Read Money Magazine.
Read Money Magazine. I read Forbes. In short, there's nothing about personal finance that I think I don't know. I imagine you've probably come across prospects and clients like that, or?
Absolutely, and I think the challenge there is that for that more experienced person, mid-career professional, who does feel knowledgeable, who does make an effort to learn and assimilate information, what's missing is often what they don't know, mm-hmm. and they don't know what they don't know. And sometimes it takes some guidance to help them find the answers to fill in the holes.
Well, let me take a step back. When you meet a prospect, can you gauge their level of financial savvy immediately? How do you discern that?
We have a process. It's a structured process in which we ask a series of questions. We ask basically the same questions to everyone that we meet with for the first time, but very quickly in that questioning process, the depth and scope of what they know and how it's applied to their life becomes pretty evident. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And how does it become evident? What kind of things do they tell you that?
We ask for a lot of documentation up front. Mm-hmm. So if we're going to meet with someone, we want to see the whole financial picture. So we'll ask for every account statement, every bank account, brokerage account, 401k account. We'll ask for copies of tax returns. We'll ask for copies of insurance policies, estate plan documents, everything. Mm-hmm. So we want to see everything, and so we're looking from a big picture point of view from the beginning. And that's very important. That sometimes just that process of collecting all of that information causes them to do things that they haven't done, or maybe ever, or certainly in a long time. I've had many times people tell me, my goodness, I didn't realize that I had so-and-so because I had not gone to the lockbox to get it out and look at it in several years. Or, when you asked for the will or the trust, I had no idea that my ex-wife was still the beneficiary on this. So a lot of things like that come out just in the information gathering process. Mm-hmm.
And how do you then communicate your value proposition to a client who maybe thinks that there's nothing that you could tell them? There's nothing that, these are people who have, or feel that they have, appropriately approached the retirement question. They've, feel that they have some healthy account balances in their brokerage accounts and retirement accounts.
Typically, it's what's caused them to be sitting in my office in the first place is that something has happened to cause them to think maybe there's something missing. It may be just a notion. It may have just a feeling. It may have been something that was said by a friend, a colleague, another advisor. But something has caused them to feel a sense of discomfort that there might be something missing. And essentially the role that we're playing is to, in many cases, they're seeing us as a second opinion, a fresh view, mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. To help them deal with that unsettledness mm-hmm. that they're feeling. Mm-hmm. Many times it's a life event. Something has happened in their lives that has caused them to look at their situation in a fresh kind of way. For example, Maybe a friend has passed away, and they're watching the surviving spouse deal with a whole lot of complex issues and not being adequately prepared for it. It causes them to think, well, I wonder if we have everything squared away. I just had that recently. I had a doctor and his wife, very prominent doctor in Little Rock, very squared away sort of person, and who thoroughly believed that he was very squared away. But they had that very situation. They had a close friend who had passed away. They watched the struggle of that surviving spouse and began to ask questions. Were they really ready? And so they got referred to me. They came in and we talked about it, began to look at their documents, going through that process I was describing. And what became evident pretty quickly is that they had significant holes in their estate plan because in their particular case, the estate plan for the husband and the wife had been prepared by different attorneys, and there had not been a coordination of that process, and they never thought about that.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So what was the gap? Being prepared by two different attorneys, two different, can you explain a little bit about what the process was that, what contradicted?
Well, in the case of the wife, she had a trust, and the trust was funded with some items, but not all the things that needed to be funded in the trust. She did not have supporting documents such as a durable power of attorney. She did not have a health care power of attorney. And she did not have a pour-over will that would have helped gather up those things that were not in the trust properly to push them into the trust. So those documents were missing from her plan. Okay.
So is that typical, or is that just bad attorney advice? How often do you deal with that, right? Especially with estate plans,
right,
high net worth clients.
Some of the worst situations I've seen for families is when there was no estate planning. The second worst is when there was estate planning done by somebody who didn't know what they were doing.
Okay.
And unfortunately, when I dig into the what's behind this story, what I find is that the estate plan was prepared by their old dear friend, neighbor, Charlie. Now, Charlie always came over every weekend for backyard barbecue, was a great friend, and he was an attorney, and offered to do this for them for free, nominal charge, whatever, as a favor to their friend. What came out in all of that is that Charlie was a real estate attorney who did, contracts for real estate transactions. And the estate planning work was dusting off the book from law school, not necessarily his area of expertise.
Right. Okay. So your role is kind of acting as a backstop for a lot of the bad advice that clients may have gotten.
Sometimes that's true, or in the case of not knowing what they don't know. I was thinking about an individual. This young man is 42 years old, very successful, works for a large company that has many portfolio companies, and he runs 9 of those companies. He's responsible for about $250 million in revenue, so this guy is not fresh.
Financially
he's a very savvy guy. But some things that happened in his life that caused him to think, maybe I don't know for sure all the things I need to know. So he starts asking around with his friends and associates and wasn't getting the kinds of answers that made him feel comfortable. So ultimately, he was referred to me. So we talk, we go through the process, and I was meeting with him last week after we had updated estate plans, met with his CPA, met with his attorney, met with his HR people about restructuring some things about his compensation. And all of those things had been taken care of. And he said, I'm sitting here realizing that I know so much about these 9 companies that I manage, and I can look at the numbers and I can tell you everything that's going on, but I had not been applying those kinds of skills in my own life. And I had a lot of things that needed attention, but I didn't know enough to know what needed attention. And this process has helped me to identify those things, to get the proper professionals to help me address those things. So he felt really, really good about the process. But it is a process. In fact, some of the speakers earlier this morning talked about a process. This is, the idea of financial planning is not a one-time event. It is not, okay, let's go through this process, let's create this nice document, and we're done. Mm-hmm. It is a living document that needs to be refreshed almost on a constant basis, certainly as needed basis, because as their life changes, as their circumstances change, as Congress meets and changes the rules, those plans have to be updated.
Mm-hmm. How often do you meet with clients?
I meet with clients generally on a quarterly or semi-annual basis, and require that they meet at least annually, so
mm-hmm.
they can't meet on a more regular frequency. Excuse me, we meet annually. And then a question that was asked earlier in one of the panels was, how often do you update the financial plan? My answer to that would be as needed. Mm-hmm. If there's a major life change, a new child being born, a spouse passes away, Aunt Susie dies and leaves a bunch of money, those kinds of events sometimes cause a need to make some adjustments to the plan. Mm-hmm. So it's not a static document.
Right. When you're dealing with clients, what are some of the common blind spots you see? What are some of their blind spots? What are areas where they're usually falling down? And this even includes people like the 42-year-old financially savvy business operator.
So many people, especially the ones that would see themselves as savvy, are trying to do the right thing. They're trying to read and keep up. And, excuse me, but they're taking in information, and many times that information it's taken in out of context. So they end up with a portfolio, and they've got a little bit of this, and they've got a little bit of that, and they've got a little bit of the other. And you ask, well, how did you come to own this particular thing? What was the decision process? And, well, it sounded good that day. Or, essentially, they sold it to me.
Now, who was they?
Whoever they were dealing with. Okay. The broker or advisor, whoever, over time, they accumulate this assemblage of all sorts of accounts and investments. And going through the questioning process, trying to discern what is it they're trying to do, what's really driving them, what are they trying to accomplish with their money. Once we see clearly what that long-term goal is, and we're looking at all these pieces and parts on the table, wait a minute. This stack over here isn't even anywhere near pointed in that direction. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Let's get all those pieces and parts working together. Let's get them all pointed in the direction of going where you want to go. But they've done all of it piecemeal as best they could, and they've never had an opportunity to get it coordinated and pointed in a single direction.
Is this kind of a result of the distinction between, in the industry, as the financial advisory industry matures, between the stockbroker of old, the salesman of Wall Street products, versus a comprehensive financial planner?
I think that contributes to it. I'm thinking about a doctor that was referred to me. This doctor was constantly taking phone calls, all sorts of people, because he's a doctor, he's a visible target, so people trying to sell him stuff. And so he had a lot of stuff, and he would fit in the category of one of these that had a lot of stuff, not necessarily pointed in the right direction. So we're trying to gather all the information, and he was struggling with getting all the information together because he didn't have that effective a filing system. So finally, we agreed to meet at his house, and he said, I've got everything, all my records in my study. And this is after weeks of trying to assemble information. Mm-hmm. We spent an evening in his study going through files, and at the end of the evening, we had found about $250,000 worth of stuff that he'd forgotten about.
Wow.
So,
it was just tucked away in various brokerage accounts?
Tucked away in various accounts, and the file on that was tucked in the bottom drawer. And
stocks?
He just didn't know what he had, yes. Yeah.
Accumulated over the years. Mm-hmm. Sold to him, in most cases.
Somebody sold it to him. Which is okay. It might have been perfectly fine at the time in the context of whatever the issues were at the time, but in light of where he was at that stage of his life, it didn't necessarily make sense.
What other blind spots do you come across? 'Cause I think there's probably an emotional element here that clients have, even financial savvy clients, have an emotional attachment to something, or are just the sheer act of overcoming inertia. They know they have accounts that need to be consolidated, rolled over. They know they need the long-term plan, and they have all the pieces in place, like you say, but just overcoming that inertia of putting it all down. How do you?
There's a need to get around to it. I was thinking about a couple. He was very ill. He had had essentially a stroke and was essentially in a comatose state. His wife is sitting there at his bedside in the hospital, realizing that she has absolutely no clue about what they have and where they have it, who they deal with, any of that kind of stuff. Because this family, just like so many families, it's one spouse or the other that will tend to take the lead in dealing with financial matters. Okay? Now, that's not a sex thing, because it could be the husband, could be the wife, but one spouse or the other will tend to take the lead, and very often the other one will say, they handle that, and so I don't have to worry about that. So that had been the case for this couple. But suddenly she was faced with the issue of, he might not come out of this. What am I going to do? Who am I going to call? Well, he did come out of that coma and that stroke, and he actually had no visible damage, so he was, conversation just as lucid as anything you'd hope for. They had an opportunity to talk about that as husband and wife, and agreed that they really needed to deal with that, needed to get her up to speed about what was going on. And about maybe a week or so later, after having made that decision, he had another stroke, back in the hospital and back in a comatose situation. The doctor, his doctor that was serving him, said, look, if based on your condition, if this happens again, you're probably going to be a vegetable or you're going to die. You've got to get your affairs in order, and you've got to move quickly, because I don't know what we're dealing with here. So they started with urgency to get their affairs in order. And so we eventually got there. And we had the meeting to discuss basically all the I's are dotted, all the T's are crossed, and so on. And he came up to me and he gave me a big double-handed handshake, big hands, double-handed handshake. He said, I can't tell you what this means to me, to have gotten this taken care of, got my wife up to speed. It was 1 week to the day later that he died. And in talking with her after his passing, one of the things that she said about that whole experience is that she said, this process has allowed me to truly experience this and be with my family in a way that I couldn't have before. Because I know everything's handled, I know where everything is, I know who to call, I have no fear about the future. And so when you talk to us about financial peace of mind, I realize I had no frames of reference to understand what you were talking about. Now I do. She said, if you're ever talking to someone who doesn't get it about what you're trying to help them do, you have them call me, I'll explain it to them.
Okay. It's true. I mean, financial peace of mind is a sort of, it's kind of a euphemism or, a platitude. It can be. But like you say, I mean, when it counts, I mean, it's the real deal. It helps you sleep. But could you talk a little bit specifically about the kinds of things that maybe were there that you had to point out to her, specifically the ways that you might help another couple avoid that kind of moment of crisis?
Well, for all couples that we work with, one of the things we insist on is that both are involved in the process, at least to understand what's going on, why it's going on, and who the players are, and who to call when something has gone wrong. Murphy's Law being what it is, very often the one in the family who handles everything is the one that goes first. I've seen it way too many times. So getting both involved is very important. And if someone's listening and you're in a situation where your spouse or your significant other doesn't know, and you're the one who handles these things, start now in really getting them engaged in the process of understanding what's where, okay? Make sure that whatever you have is designed to do what you need done. Investments, people talk about investments and say this is a good investment, that's a bad investment. I don't believe that any of that's true necessarily. The investments are designed to do what they do. And if you need that done, then that might be a great thing. But if you don't need that done, why on earth are you buying it?
Explain that a little bit more. When you need that done.
Well, for example, I had a situation referred to me some years ago. And this lady is widowed, has a substantial portfolio, and this is quite a few years ago, back in the days of lots of limited partnerships. She needed income. She needed steady cash flow. And she had been sold a bucket load of limited partnerships that produced no income. They were growth-oriented, were illiquid, and she was stuck for years.
So not master limited partnerships, positions in
Oh,
limited
yeah,
partnerships.
this is a long time ago.
Yeah.
So there, everything that she owned in that portfolio was totally not designed to do what she needed done.
Because she needed
Income.
income.
She needed a steady cash flow.
And so if you come across a client like that who has a lot of limited partnerships sold to them early, need income, what steps would you take to rectify that situation?
In that particular case, there wasn't a whole lot that could be done. This is probably 20 years ago. But more current examples would be, someone who has extensive cash and in bond holdings. At today's interest rates, that's not much yield. And if they really need income, they've got to look at some possible alternatives.
Are you, just getting a little more specific, are you advising clients now to avoid bonds? Are you asking them to get out of bonds because of the possibility of a rising interest rate?
Not necessarily to get out, but certainly to be very careful about maturities on bonds and credit ratings on bonds, those kind of things. We're generally a lot shorter in our portfolios right now than we would normally be, just because we're concerned about what rates are going to do and when they're going to do it.
And so when you get a client who feels that they're stock pickers, they know how to pick stocks, and you see them kind of moving in the, picking I don't know, speculative tech stocks, how do you reel them back in, or where do you suggest that they look? If you're talking to a typical 50-something-year-old client approaching 10, 15 years away from retirement, where are you telling them to look now? And how do you have that conversation with them to tell them move away from their
The risky
Jim
behavior.
Cramer-inspired stock picking
Right.
kind of?
In that case, what I try to discern if that's really something that entertains them, it's something they enjoy. If that's the case, great. Let's take an amount of money that you could feel comfortable and cheerfully willing to completely lose it. And if you're, whether it's 20,000 or 200,000 or whatever the number is, pick a number that you're totally comfortable with taking whatever kind of risk. Let's set that aside in a separate account and watch Jim Cramer all day long. Go for it with just that amount of money. The serious money, the part of your money that is going to take care of your long-term future, let's handle that in a different way. So if you want to play, just do it over here, but let's not let the playtime become part of what we're trying to do that's serious money.
So you'd recommend a flyer fund of sorts?
That's right.
Yeah, that's a smart idea. What else? For retirees, you specialize in retirement income. Where are you looking now for retirement income? Where would you recommend clients find that at the moment?
With retirement income, one of the things we stress to clients is to not look so much at income yield, as in a bond paying a yield type of return or a stock paying a dividend return, But look at the total return of the portfolio. Look at the entire portfolio. Look at it on a total return basis and think in terms of withdrawal rate. If we have the portfolio invested in the appropriate way, and what's the rate of withdrawal that we can withdraw and have a reasonable likelihood of staying ahead of inflation over time. Because in retirement, among all the various risks that individuals would face, one of the biggest risks that they face financially is they might just live a long time. I mean, think about it. Whatever amount of money you have, if you knew for a fact that you were being taken from this earth 2 weeks from Thursday, you probably have enough to get 2 weeks from Thursday.
Sure.
Matter of fact, you could probably go party and enjoy it. But if you might just be here till 104, that's really stretching it out a lot further. So that's a significant financial risk that has to be taken into consideration. So looking at it on a total return basis and a withdrawal rate basis is a much safer way of looking at it. It's the way that foundations and endowments would look at it. And they're managing money with a forever lifetime kind of viewpoint. So
not risking principal at all.
Right.
Do you have a number that kind of floats out there? People talk about the 4% withdrawal rate for retirees. Is there a number that kind of bounces around that you gauge against?
Well, there's a lot of academic argument, and this is probably not the setting to try to settle that issue. But yes, the range is 4 or 5% or so for most of those discussions. If you wanted to sustain money for a very long time frame, or perhaps a forever time frame, then a withdrawal rate in that 4 or 5% range is probably going to be appropriate. There are a lot of people who, when they look at their personal affairs, don't necessarily need to preserve principal for absolutely forever. I mean, I have clients who literally say, I want my last check to bounce, which is, it's okay. Yeah. So in looking at not only your life expectancy, but also your attitudes toward how much estate you want to leave, it might be appropriate to have a higher withdrawal rate or a higher withdrawal rate perhaps as you age. So it just depends on the individual circumstances.
Can you speak a little bit about in terms of retirement planning, the importance of the decumulation phase? And I think maybe a lot of clients don't realize the planning that goes into, do we withdraw from taxable, tax-deferred accounts first? Which one comes first? Social Security, now, later? How do you approach those questions?
Again, it's specific to the individual situation, but on a broad brush basis, we're going to try to preserve that tax deferral in those retirement accounts like 401k plans, that sort of thing, for as long as we can. So in the early years of retirement, particularly if they retired early, we'll try to draw from taxable accounts to preserve that tax deferral a little longer. If they can, we want to delay Social Security at least until normal retirement age. Or if they're taking early retirement and they're looking at filing for Social Security at 62 or 63, be very careful with that because of the income limitations. If you wanted to have a part-time job, do some consulting work, that kind of thing, severe income limitations might be restrictive to getting you where you want to go. If a client can wait until age 70 for drawing on Social Security, then they're going to get a maximum benefit.
Are there any strategies you have for getting around those income limitations in retirement?
Well,
do people set up limited liability corporations? I don't know. Is there?
Well, the restriction on Social Security has to do with earned income. So probably the simplest and best strategy is to avoid having filed in the first place until normal retirement age.
Okay. And so what else? If we're talking about near retirees, what about highly compensated executives? You come across that, I'm sure, a lot. How do those executive compensation plans play into retirement?
Again, depends on what they have, but if they have, for example, maybe it's a large company, they have stock options, we look at when those options are maturing, when they can be exercised, tax consequences of that. If they have deferred comp plans, Many times those can provide cash flow in the early years of retirement and allow us to continue the deferral on the accumulated funds in the retirement funds. So it's kind of an individualized look at the situation, look at the needs, and develop the strategy around the circumstances rather than any hard and fast rules that
Sure.
generically apply to everybody.
Sure. So one of the things that we hear a lot about and financial advisors talk about today is a goals-based planning. What does that mean to you? What does goals-based planning mean to you?
There was a book many years ago that I thought had a great title. If you don't know where you're going, you'll probably end up someplace else. So to me, in goals-based planning, it's very important to understand, what are we trying to do here? Why are we trying to do it? What can I be comfortable with along the journey toward achieving that goal? If we get those elements working together, then not only does the chance of achieving the goal become more likely, but we'll be more comfortable along the way. So I'm very much a proponent of, let's understand the big picture of what we're trying to do here and why we're trying to do it. What's really important to you about your money and about your life. Let's use those as the drivers that guide us on what to do with the money.
I've often thought about that because I've heard this kind of answer before. If someone asked me that question, I would have a hard time answering it. I think my initial, maybe it's my age or something, but I think my initial answer would be like, I'd like as much of it as possible.
Most of us would.
What are the nuances there that you try to get out of?
Well, some of that can be revealed with the proper kinds of questions. But basically, I'd say that most people really haven't thought about that. And so asking the question, what's important to you about money? What's important about money to you? That, for many people that I talk with, is a profound question, that gives them pause, and they have to really think about that. And then as they begin to open up and expound on an answer, the impression I get many times is that they are beginning to reveal things to themselves that they hadn't really allowed to bubble up. And in a husband and wife situation, very common, this one spouse turns to the other and says, I didn't realize you felt that way. You never told me that. So
what kind of things do you hear? Tell me what those things would be. Give me some specific examples of what you hear in those conversations.
If you were to boil them down to their most basic essence, for most people, ultimately what they want is not a whole bunch of money. They want enough. They want enough to do the things that they want to do, go the places they want to go, buy the things they want to buy. And they want to do that without having to worry about it. They want to be free from stress about money. So they will begin to use words like comfort and peace of mind, a sense of security. It's much larger than X number of dollars in the bank or something. It's a feeling of, I'm going to be okay. And I know no matter what, I'm going to be okay. And for many, many people that I talk to, that's ultimately what they're thinking about. Now, they may clothe it in all sorts of terms initially in the conversation, but when we get to the meat of it, that's what they're really thinking about.
Let me ask you to tell us some of the, for lack of a better term, some of the stupidest things you've seen people do with their money.
I got referred to a fellow one time who had lost a bunch of money. This guy is a periodontist, a very successful professional in his town. And at the time that I met him, he and his wife were having in-depth conversations, shall we say. She was pretty upset at the amount of money that he'd lost. So dig into the situation, and his accountant had got him in on a hot deal. That was a sure thing, and
the accountant did this.
The accountant did this, yeah. Who's an investment expert. Now, I will share with you the details of the investment, and you just tell me on the surface if it sounds like a hot deal that you'd want to jump into. We're going to invest in shrimp boats operating off the coast of Venezuela. That's our investment, okay? Now, this is a guy in southern Arkansas who's making a decision to invest in shrimp boats to work off the coast of Venezuela. We got a good head start there.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, later it was discovered that these boats were running drugs and were ultimately all captured and confiscated. And so the entire investment went to Zip. And at a mid-career place, he was having to start over. And he did this with his retirement funds.
I was going to say, can you tell the amount of money he lost in that?
This is probably 20, 25 years ago, and it was over $1 million that he had invested in this thing.
And he came to you after the fact?
After the fact. Yeah, so we were in a rebuilding phase for a very long time. It ultimately turned out fine. He's doing fine. The wife and he are getting along better now.
Yeah.
But it was tough in the beginning. But when I learned that they were investing in shrimp boats operating off the coast of Venezuela, it's like, I'm sorry, that doesn't even pass the smell test.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It just doesn't make any sense at all.
Yeah, that would be a tough one. Talking people off the ledge of things like that, it almost sounds like your role, you see the role of financial advisor as telling people, the things that they, letting them aware of the things that they don't know, bringing them back from the edge, kind of keeping them from doing the wrong thing, right? It's less about pointing them in the right investments to make and more about protecting them from their own kind of worst impulses, be it gullibility, like the shrimp boat guy, inertia, or just blind spots.
It's an element of both, depending on the individual. For many folks that we work with, giving them guidance to help them steer in the direction that they want to go is enough. For some personality types that want to take the flyer and do that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. Keeping them reined in so they don't hurt themselves is pretty important. Let me
throw out a few scenarios here. What for mid-career couple looking for college planning, what kind of things would you suggest to them?
Several avenues available, but the best one right now would be 529 plans. Mm-hmm. In some cases, we don't look to any specific college funding vehicle, because once it's in the college funding vehicle, there's some limitations and strings attached. But of the types of plans out there, 529 plans would be probably the most effective for most people's situations.
When you say there's strings attached, in terms of you can only spend it on education?
Right, right. Or with educational savings accounts, for example. If we open an educational savings account for a child and deposit money in there, that money is earmarked for education. That's a good thing. But that educational account, Uniform Gift to Minors account type of account, would become essentially the child's property at the age of majority in their state. Sometimes that 18-year-old is not necessarily going to make the best decisions about what to do with that money, and it may not be educationally oriented. On the other hand, a 529 plan is designed to be an educational savings vehicle, but it's also flexible. If we have 3 children, and this one gets hot and cold running scholarships, and this one doesn't, and we had the plan for this one, we can switch and make those funds available to this other child, or any immediate family member. Mm-hmm. So a lot more flexibility there. And if nobody needs those funds, as it turns out, for education, then to some extent the 529 plan becomes an additional retirement account.
A 529 plan could become an additional retirement account?
Yeah.
Can you withdraw money from a 529 plan for retirement if there's no education component? You pay taxes on it, correct?
Exactly, which you would be paying taxes on a retirement account anyway. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you can use a 529 plan as sort of a de facto deferred taxable account for retirement.
Could. That wouldn't be the best way to do it if that was your intent, but if you have an educational savings intent, that's a nice side benefit that there's flexibility. It's also flexible as to who can contribute to it. Mm-hmm. So grandma and grandpa can get involved in the process. Mm-hmm. Aunts and uncles can get involved in the process to contribute to this plan.
In your role as a financial advisor, do you help parents of college students navigate that process, that financial aid application process? Is that a role that you play?
Not very often.
Okay.
Not very often. We have on a few occasions, but there are people who specialize in those things and who try to get them that kind of help.
Okay. You spoke earlier about clients who their trusts, their estate plans were confused and messed up. When you're advising people on putting together an estate plan, beyond just making sure everybody knows where all the documents are any kind of specific recommendations that you have for trusts, wealth transfer, preservation of capital?
Yes. First of all, the basic estate plan, at a minimum, would include at least a will or a trust, or perhaps both. It would have a durable power of attorney, and it would have a healthcare power of attorney, living will type of document. That's the minimum. Okay? In the notion of a will, the will is a document that is going to spell out your wishes, what's going to happen to your estate after your death. But generally speaking, the administration of that process is going to be through the probate court. So there'll be attorneys involved, there'll be documents involved, court costs involved, and it can be a complicated and somewhat expensive process. A trust provides an alternative to that whole process, in which essentially a lot of the things that would have been done after death are done before death, so that at the time of someone's passing, there's actually very little to do. And it's a much easier, it's a much more, not only easier process, but it's also a private process. That probate court process is a public process, and you can go to the courthouse and a nosy neighbor can check into your business. If we're going to make a gift to a child, there's a choice. Do we make that gift outright? Here's the money, or here's the asset. Or do we give it to them in trust? If the trust is properly drawn, we can allow them to be the trustee of the trust, the beneficiary of the trust. But from a legal standpoint, it's not a gift to them, it's a gift to the trust, which is separate from them, which is important because it's not their money personally. Therefore, generally speaking, it is not marital property, not subject to division and divorce. It is not accessible generally by creditors. So they could have a very bad business situation, automobile accident, that sort of thing, and somebody coming after their personal assets, but these assets in trust would be protected. So there's a lot of advantages to using trusts, and we recommend to clients to talk with their attorney about using trusts as a gift vehicle for children.
Will you work with a client's attorney?
Absolutely.
Do you often do that?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I'm not an attorney. I'm not a CPA, but work with those professionals to get the tax advice, the legal advice.
And do you often find clients have these people already in mind, or do you often refer clients to attorneys and CPAs?
There's a good mix of both. If they already have a relationship with a competent attorney, then that's great. If they don't, we can refer them to someone that we know the quality of their work. The importance thing that we stress to clients is that when it comes to estate planning, this is a very specialized area of law. It's very important to deal with an attorney who does this kind of work as a primary portion of their practice. If they really know their way around in estate planning law, then they're probably at least worth talking to. A medical analogy would be if we discovered that you needed heart surgery, you probably are not going to let your family doctor do the surgery. You're probably going to want to get a referral to the best cardiac surgeon you can find. Let's go find the best attorney we can find that's a specialist in this particular area.
But I'm also going to want a surgeon who would know a little something of my history.
Absolutely.
Know about my habits, do you find when you're working with estate attorneys to create an estate plan for a client that you need to help that attorney realize some of the nuances of the family's dynamics to inform the estate plan? maybe there's an errant child and you need some clauses in there to keep, them on the, incentive trusts, or, perhaps they have a philanthropic bent and they want to,
Right. Most attorneys that we work with have their own process for discerning those kinds of issues, but yes, we get involved in conveying what information we have. We get the client's permission to share information with the attorney. It's making a team of advisors work together. That's another problem, by the way, for a lot of people, is they'll have a relationship with a banker, with an insurance agent, with an attorney, with a CPA, and none of those guys ever talk to each other. Mm-hmm. If you could get all of those guys essentially or conceptually around the table and all talking about the same situation at the same time, you get a different result. So we encourage coordination of these advisors. And
in your experience as the financial advisor, usually, they talk about the quarterback of the team.
At least in our practice, very often that is the role that we play. Mm-hmm. It frequently comes up that way. And then, much like my comment earlier about the financial planning process, you need to look at the estate planning process as also a living process. We encourage clients, now we've got everything in place, we've got the wills and trusts and so on. If nothing happens in your life that changes anything about anything, at least 3 years from now, and we put them on a 3-year schedule, 3 years from now, let's sit down and look at these documents again. Mm-hmm. Let's make sure that they say the things you want them to say and that the assets go where you want them to go based on how you see the world 3 years from now. If there's something missing, something that's not quite right, then let's go back and get adjustments made. If nothing is popping off the page that needs attention, at least go usually back to the same attorney and say, is there anything that I need to know about updating these documents? Many times Congress has met. Mm-hmm. Some of the rules have changed. Yep. General business practices have changed. I've had many clients who had a perfectly fine estate plan in place, but the business practices among banks and brokerage firms and so on have changed enough, legal departments have changed enough that a durable power of attorney, for example, that was written 10, 15 years ago, probably won't pass muster in today's environment.
Really? Is that true?
It needs to be updated.
Why is that? Because they've just expired? Is there an expiration date on powers of attorney? Is that?
It's not a question of expiration date. It's a question of interpretation. Okay. 20 years ago, an attorney would write a durable power of attorney, and the durable power of attorney, if I was giving you power of attorney, yep, it would say, I'm giving you the power to do whatever needs to be done. And that's essentially what it would say. Yep. Well, some legal department at some brokerage firm would say, well, but it didn't specifically mention the IRA account, so we're not going to honor this document.
Really?
So now the documents that we're seeing coming out from attorneys is a pretty thick document in which it enumerates a long grocery list of every kind of possible situation you could even think of, and a lot of stuff that wouldn't even apply to your situation, but it's all on the grocery list because of the business environment that we're in.
All the more reason to know where all those hidden accounts are and those exactly forgotten brokerage statements. Yeah.
This evolving nature of business practices, laws, and so on, I saw an interesting example of that in my own experience. My wife and I came to a place a couple of years ago where we needed to update our estate plan. So we'd gone back to our attorney and we needed to make all these changes. And so the changes got made. And we had the meeting with the attorney to look at the final draft before we were going to sign. Mm-hmm. Checked everything. It all looks good. He said, okay, I'll get the final copies printed. I'll have my office call you and we'll arrange a time for the signing. Great. Well, some time passed, and I get a note from the attorney, and he says, the reason we haven't contacted you is I've decided to make some changes. Here's a revised document. And it was durable power of attorney was the document that had been changed. And I asked him, what was he said, well, because of this law that was passed in Arkansas, we've decided to make these changes so that the document would have a longer shelf life. Mm-hmm. So the draft that I had seen some months earlier actually changed before we actually signed it, just because of changing circumstances in the legal environment.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. Well, that's great. About 12:45, I want to make sure we leave time open for questions if there are any. Any questions for Eric? Why don't we start right here? Sure.
There's one right here and one over here.
Good afternoon. As you mentioned about this attorney in trust and wills, I have a client here. He's also resident of New York and Florida, but he has a girlfriend who is living with from last 7 years, and now she's giving a hard time to him to not put his property in trust. So she's claiming her share, though she's not married to him, and he had a will in place where he's the owner of the property. So how this can affect his planning as far as trust is concerned? Can he just, is the same trust laws are everywhere, like in New York and Florida are the same, or is there any way that he can get rid of, save himself from this girl's problem?
That's a pretty broad question. Part of the answer is that each state has its own laws, and the state of primary tax residence or primary residence would be the state that would prevail in the overall picture. But in the case of clients who have property in multiple states, generally speaking, they're going to be better served by using an attorney not only licensed in those states, but also probably through a trust vehicle. That's getting into some significant complexity.
There's no relationship between the man and the woman? I see. Okay, so there might be some. Yeah.
Property cannot put into trust because
She's claiming some.
This client needs a good attorney. Yes.
So Eric, perhaps this is a less complicated question, but real life nonetheless. In fact, it's born out of a recent dinner conversation with a group of friends in a mid-career situation in which a couple has been buying term insurance for the last 20 years. Made decisions earlier in their life when they were raising their children that the lower premiums associated with that insurance were the right way to go. Well, here they are in their mid-50s, and all of a sudden they got the renewal notice on their 20-year term, and it's exponentially grown. So the question is, what do we do now? We didn't think we could afford the higher insurance before. How would you advise someone in that situation? Because, what are their options at that point?
That's a challenge. And we do see that from time to time. What they've got to look at first is, what are the objectives? What do they need this insurance to do for them? What would this death benefit do that they need done? If they've accumulated assets in retirement accounts and savings accounts and other investments and so on, it may be that looking at their overall situation, they may no longer need insurance in the same way that they did 20 years ago. Or they may not need as much. They may not need any at all. You have to look at those circumstances. I'm dealing with a situation right now where the individual has a term life insurance policy that is maturing next year, and then the premiums are going to go to, I don't know, $75,000 a year or something. It's just an incredible number. But after really looking at his situation and understanding his objectives, he really doesn't need the insurance at all. So there's no need to rebuy. But if there is a need to rebuy, sooner than later, healthier is better. I would move quickly on that issue if there's a potential for a need to buy.
Would they stay in term insurance, however, or would they convert over to a universal at that point?
Okay, the question was, would they stay in term insurance or
Convert to a universal.
convert to a more permanent form of insurance? Again, the answer is driven by what is the need and when is that need. Many times the term insurance can be a perfectly appropriate tool if there is a definite need. For example, if the goal is I want this insurance to make sure that the mortgage on the house is paid for, okay? We've got 9 years to go on this mortgage, and everything's on track to have this paid for by the time we retire, okay? Well, if you want to absolutely guarantee that mortgage gets paid, a 10-year term policy might be a perfectly appropriate thing to help with that. But then once that mortgage is paid, if that's the only objective, then there's no more need for the insurance. Again, we've got to look at the situation.
One more question over here.
Hey, guys. I was curious, my understanding with the gifting of money to maybe a child or a grandchild, the purpose is to get the money out of the estate. Is there any reason a midlife person would gift? Is there any tax benefit for that scenario, or is it really just for an estate purpose only for people that are thinking about, leaving money to heirs and cleaning out, making sure their estate doesn't get taxed so high?
It's much less of a tax-driven thing than it used to be. The earlier panel talked about the $14,000 that could be given to someone, and that's a per-person limit. And so husband and wife could give $28,000, for example, to a child in a given year. All that does from a tax standpoint is to say that we could, as husband and wife, we could make that gift and there's no gift tax returns to file, there's no paperwork, we could simply give the money. Okay? If we go over that amount, then we probably would need to file a gift tax return, but under the current estate laws, with the estate tax limit being so high, over $10 million for husband and wife, we have a lot of opportunity to make gifts, if that's appropriate. In advising clients, especially earlier in mid-career kind of clients, I caution them on making too much gift too early, because I want to make sure that their circumstances are covered before they start giving away to the children. Now, if their needs are met and there's still excess, given the current environment, what I'm seeing many families do is begin to make gifts strategically with children to help them move to the next stage of life, to get that first house, to start that business, to take a step that they might not have otherwise been able to take. And they're viewing it as a chance to make a gift while they get to see the benefit over time, as opposed to everything after death and they don't get to see it, or at least as far as we know.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, I had one more question. At what age, we talk about insurance, things like that, long-term disability care, and at what stage, what age, general, should I start thinking about things like that?
About long-term care or disability?
I mean, it's...
Well, let's take each of those separately. Disability insurance is, by definition, protection of your ability to earn income. So if you have your whole financial plan in place and it's everything's going to be great and wonderful, as long as you're able to save this much and do these various things, all based on your income. But if your income is taken out of the picture, a lot of those long-term plans may go by the wayside. So disability income insurance is a way of replacing some portion of that income flow so that those long-term goals can still be met and current living expenses can still be met. So it's replacement of income. Now, when we talk about long-term care insurance, it's a whole different category, and this deals with all of the Medicare rules. Basically, when folks turn 65, They fall under Medicare, generally speaking, which is a government program. And the government, in its infinite wisdom, knows exactly how you can be sick and how long it takes for you to get well, what procedures are appropriate, how long you'll be in the hospital, etc. And all of this is very carefully prescribed and documented. So what happens is, if you have a health event under Medicare and you don't do your part, that is, get well on time, the hospitals and doctors involved really have no choice but to get you out the door. And where they're going to take you is to some place that under Medicare rules is a non-hospital. So it might be called rehabilitation center, long-term convalescent center, nursing home. Could have lots of different names. It might look like and walk like and smell like a hospital, but it's not technically a hospital under Medicare rules. Well, when you go to that facility, there's only so many days that you get to be there before Medicare shuts the money off. And if you haven't gotten well on time or have health conditions that are going to extend over a longer period of time, the money for that is now going to come out of your pocket. National average for that sort of thing is about $6,000 plus a month per person. And regardless of how much money you have, $6,000, $7,000 a month can be a pretty significant dent in the family budget. So long-term care insurance or vehicles that can provide for long-term care are pretty important to consider, and the ideal time to consider that, in my view, is in the early to, but no later than mid-50s. So we begin having that conversation with clients about age 50. Because if they'll make the decision at that point, they've got a lot of options. They're generally healthy enough to buy that long-term care insurance or buy some other vehicle that would support their care needs. And they can do it economically in their early 50s.
All things being equal, you recommend long-term care insurance?
Conceptually. Now, if the notion of long-term care is something all of us are going to face, statistically. You know, in this crowd of this size, there are people in this room who are going to face a long-term care event, okay? The question is, how are we going to pay for it? And the risk that we have that we're going to pay out of pocket and therefore render ourselves penniless. By the way, the government does have a program after you're completely broke. It's called Medicaid, and if you are completely broke and can prove it, then the government will take care of you. But in between there, you spend down your own assets. But for a more affluent individual, many times there are types of life insurance policies and annuity products that have long-term care riders to where you can take some of the investment money that you might have, savings that you might have, and essentially change the character of it to give it a long-term care benefit that comes into play if you need it. And if you never need it, then you still have the benefit of the life insurance or the annuity or whatever it is. And it's not a pure expense like a long-term care insurance policy would be. But that's more applicable for a more affluent client.
Okay, great. Decisions that we make with a financial advisor. So, Eric, thanks very much for joining us.
Enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Great discussion.